So we left out one sampling technique last time. That's actually still a good sampling technique. It's called multi-stage sampling. And multi-stage sampling is a good sampling technique that uses combinations of the good techniques we've seen so far done in succession. So as an example, suppose we wanted to survey Colorado residents. A multi-stage sampling technique would go like this. Break the counties into groups. So we have urban, suburban, rural, farming communities. And then choose counties from each of those groups using a stratified sample. So we'll randomly select, we have to figure out how many, but randomly select some urban areas, some suburban areas, some rural areas, and some rural farming areas. So I'm thinking rural without farming and rural with farming as separate kind of groups. Choose some counties that way to get sufficient, to make sure that we are representing all parts of Colorado, that we didn't somehow miss the rural or farming or suburban or urban communities. It'd be pretty hard to miss these two, but it might be easy to miss those. Be careful about how many. You'd want to determine about how many individuals you expect to include in your sample. I suppose you would want the number of individuals, or the proportion of individuals, I suppose, from each of these groups to be about the same. So if you're going to survey like 1 in 100 residents, you would take 1% of the urban population and try to find them in these urban counties, and 1% of suburban, and so on. And then pick enough counties that you can get that 1%. In each county then, we're going to choose a few neighborhoods. We'll choose enough neighborhoods that we can get the number of residents that we want to survey. And then we'll sample all individuals, so that's cluster sampling, cluster all individuals in each. So that way we only have to visit a few neighborhoods, we don't have to drive all over Colorado. Well, some driving has to happen. But in these counties, once you're in the county, you choose a few neighborhoods and you go from neighborhood to neighborhood and interview all the people. And that'll give you a multi-stage sample of Colorado residents. It's a common way to do things. It's not too expensive because it minimizes the work of the survey people. And then we move on to the new section, which is section 1.5, things that go wrong in sampling. Of course, the thing that goes wrong in sampling is bias, and the sample is called biased, or suffers from bias, sometimes we'll say that, if it is chosen in such a way so as to systematically not represent the population. Now, every sample doesn't represent the population perfectly, but we try to choose a sampling method so on average it does a good job. A sampling method is called biased if on average it doesn't do a good job. There's types of bias that can be obtained in sampling. Here they are, 3 types of bias. Sampling bias or undercoverage. That is when more or less what happens is some individuals are left off the sampling frame. So the ones you try to contact, that list that you have of people you'd like to contact, you're not going to reach some people. So if you use like phone numbers, and then you know lots of people aren't even going to pick up, but even if you use phone numbers, you don't have unlisted phone numbers to even try to contact. You don't have individuals without phones. There's almost none, but there's homeless people, but they even have phones, I think, now. So as you try to obtain a list of all the residents of, say, of Colorado, if you wanted to do that, it'd be very difficult to get that list. You can use voter registrations, you can use income tax forms, but you're still missing lots of folks in a systematic way. So that's called sampling bias or undercoverage, systematically missing some kinds of people. Non-response bias, this happens when individuals refuse to respond. Like me, I'll refuse to respond to a sample. I won't pick up my phone. I won't allow someone to approach me at the mall. They say, "Can I have a few minutes of your time?" That's not going to happen. You get something in the mail. Would you mind filling out this form? I get an email saying, could you, here's a Google Doc I'd like you to read and respond to. And anyone doesn't want to do that, those sampling techniques would be subject to non-response bias, because you're just not going to do it. Response bias, that's when individuals don't respond truthfully. Now, you could not respond truthfully because you're embarrassed to respond. They ask you, or you're scared to respond, or something like that. If someone asked you, say, how many calories do you consume per day? You might say 1,500, thinking that's a good number, but you don't even know how many calories you consume a day. So you can't respond truthfully because you don't know. If someone shows up at your door and asks you how much you weigh, you haven't weighed yourself in a long time, you don't know what that weight is, you'll give them a number, 180 pounds. But it's probably not the truth. And then you could also not respond truthfully because you don't really understand the question. So not understanding the question is sort of even worse. You think the interviewer is asking you something different than what the interviewer is actually saying. So ordinarily, before they would do a survey, people would hold focus groups with people and read the questions and ask them, what do you think this question means? When you answer it, what question are you really answering? Is there something behind the scenes that you think is important that you want to tell us? And then once they get that feedback, then they can alter the questions to make sure that they're capturing the information that they really would like to collect, and also to make it easier for the people to respond truthfully, maybe by adding a few extra words to explain, well, if you have weighed yourself in the past week, how much do you weigh? Otherwise, could you let us know how much you think you weigh, and we could record those two things separately if you're trying to get weights of people. And I guess that's going to end this slide with discussion of multi-stage sampling and different kinds of bias that can happen in sampling despite these two things, or despite your best efforts to pick a representative group of people. Maybe they refuse to respond, and maybe they don't respond correctly or honestly or truthfully. And we'll be on to our next slide any minute.